Hi, I'm Natalia Hakimi, and my project is called The Effect of Wording, Party Affiliation, and Source on Perceptions of COVID-19 Vaccines. The coronavirus, or COVID-19, is a deadly virus that has affected millions all over the globe and has forced the world to be extremely cautious. Everyone has heard that we are in unprecedented times, too many times to count. As of the 8th of April, there have been 30.7 million cases of COVID-19 in the US alone and 556,000 deaths in the US due to the outbreak of COVID-19. And anti-vaxxers are one of the top 10 health threats in the world today, and this number has quadrupled since 2001. 1/4 of Americans refuse to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And as of April 6, 62.4 million Americans have been vaccinated, which is only 18.8% of the United States population. And we need 70 to 80% of the population to be fully vaccinated to reach herd immunity and end this coronavirus pandemic once and for all. Here is the literature review. Studies have shown that statements that focus on more of the positive aspects of a message were deemed more plausible than the negatively worded ones. And Republicans tend to have more of a positive attitude towards religious leaders than Democrats, as Democrats tend to have more of a trust in and a positive attitude in the scientists and in the government than their Republican counterparts. And studies have shown that vaccine hesitancy is lowest in Democrats, as they are 14% more likely than Republicans to say that they would probably or definitely get a COVID-19 vaccine. And overall, with every vaccine, Democrats are more likely to get a vaccine, as they do have that higher trust in scientists and in the government. And vaccine hesitancy is highest in Republicans because they're twice as likely not to trust the scientists as opposed to Democrats. Based on past literature, I was able to develop my hypotheses. So first, compared to a vaccine recommended by scientists, a vaccine recommended by a religious leader will A, be trusted more by Republicans as opposed to their Democratic counterparts, and B, Democrats will be more likely to say that they will get the vaccine as opposed to their Republican counterparts. Additionally, it is hypothesized that the message that reads, which makes it one of the most successful vaccines ever created, will be trusted most, have the highest intent to get vaccinated, and be perceived as least risky. Here's my experimental stimuli, where I manipulated the source and part of the message. The first source that you could see here is the CSA, or Concerned Scientists of America, and the source is always shown at the top left corner with the logo, or at the bottom in the copyright section. And the first sentence was also manipulated, and in here you could see it was manipulated to say, even after vaccination, it is important to take precautions. The second source you could see that I used was the CRA, or Concerned Religious Leaders of America, and the second wording manipulation was, which makes it one of the most successful vaccines ever created. Lastly, you could see the control vignette, which has no source and no additional wording manipulation. By combining all of these manipulations, I ended up having 9 conditions. To measure the participants' trust in information, perceived vaccine risk, and intent to obtain the vaccine, I used 10-point scales. I used 3 items to measure their trust in information. One sample is this information is trustworthy, and these items had a Chromax alpha of 0.94. To measure the perceived risk, I used 4 items. A sample is how risky do you judge the vaccine against COVID-19 to be, and the items had a Chromax alpha of 0.92. I also used 1 item to measure their intent to get the vaccine, which was, if you had the chance to get vaccinated against COVID-19 next week, what would you do? And I received permission to use all these items. After creating the survey in Stimuli and Qualtrics, I used Amazon's Mechanical Turk to recruit adult participants. I used 203 participants for data analysis using SPSS. I ran ANOVAs and Tukey post-hocs to analyze my data. So as you can see here, I have the effect of wording on the intent to obtain the vaccine. I ran ANOVAs and Tukey post-hocs to analyze my data. The ANOVA showed overall significance with a p-value of 0.04. And the post-hoc showed that the difference between the simple and precaution message approached significance with a p-value of 0.082. While there was a significant effect on the message on the intent to obtain the vaccine, it was not in the direction I hypothesized. As seen in the graph, the precaution message had a greatest intent to get the vaccine, and it was approaching significance as it differed from the simple message. So people may intend to get the vaccine more when reading the precaution message because it's a two-sided message. Past literature has emphasized that the difference in efficacies between two-sided and one-sided messages depend on the message and what is trying to be persuaded. However, there are some pieces of literature that have shown that two-sided messages can overall be effective in advertising. So this study shows that two-sided messages are most effective when promoting a vaccine. And as I hypothesized that the message that emphasized how successful the vaccine would have the highest intent, my hypothesis was refuted. My additional hypotheses were also refuted as there were no significant effects of wording on people's trust and risk perceptions of the vaccine. So as you can see here, the results also refuted my hypothesis that Democrats were more likely than Republicans to get the vaccine when reading the scientific source over the religious source, as the results were insignificant. It also refuted my hypothesis that Republicans would be more likely than Democrats to get the vaccine when reading the religious source over the scientific source. Although there was insignificance, the hypothesis wasn't completely refuted. When running a post hoc, there was a p-value of 0.063 that approached significance. This means that overall participants were more likely to want the vaccine after reading the document that had a religious source with a mean of 8.12 rather than no source with a mean of 7.2. A possible explanation for this difference between the conditions is that people feel that a document with a source rather than no source is more reputable. So here are my limitations and further study. It would also be interesting to examine how the religion of the participant affects their risk perception, trust in the information presented, and intent to receive the vaccine. The interaction between the scientific source, the religious source, and the religion of the participant would also give me more insight on the best way to communicate with particular groups. And the severity of how religious someone is and how it affects these same variables would also be interesting to examine, and how they interact with the other variables present in my study. I can also use the same data to examine the demographics and political party affiliation of people who received the vaccine and people who didn't receive the vaccine, as I used no participants in my study who already received the vaccine or were planning to get the vaccine, as they had already scheduled an appointment. And here are my references. This study and further studies should help us better understand how to best persuade people to get the COVID vaccine and other vaccines like this one in the future, so we can hopefully end this pandemic once and for all. Thank you for listening.